Michael? Michael! This can't be happening!
The morning after I married the love of my life, I woke up alone. His side of the bed was cold. His clothes were gone. And on the nightstand, a single folded note that would shatter everything I thought I knew about the man I'd just vowed to spend forever with. What I read in those 4 sentences didn't just break my heart. It exposed a secret so dangerous, so unbelievable, that for the next 6 months, I didn't know if my husband was alive or dead, or if I'd ever been safe at all. This is the true story of my wedding night, the disappearance that followed, and the truth that was buried long before I ever said I do. My name is Katherine Morgan. I'm 52 years old, a high school English teacher from Charleston, South Carolina. And 2 years ago, I thought I'd found my second chance at love after a painful divorce that had left me questioning whether I'd ever trust anyone again. For 5 years, I'd thrown myself into work, into my daughter Emma who was away at college, into anything that would keep me from feeling the emptiness that had settled into my bones. I'd almost convinced myself that I was fine being alone, that I didn't need anyone, that the idea of romance was something for younger women, for people who hadn't already failed once at forever. But then I met him at a charity fundraiser for the local children's hospital in October of 2022. His name was Michael Crawford, or at least that's what he told me. He was standing by the silent auction table, studying a painting of the Carolina coastline with this thoughtful expression that made him seem a million miles away. He was tall, maybe 6'1", with salt and pepper hair that was just starting to gray at the temples, and these warm hazel eyes that crinkled when he smiled. When I walked past, he turned and asked me what I thought of the painting, and something about the way he spoke, quiet and genuinely curious, made me stop. We ended up talking for 3 hours that night. He told me he was a financial consultant who'd recently relocated from Boston, that he'd wanted a fresh start somewhere warmer, somewhere slower. He loved classic literature, especially Steinbeck and Hemingway. He volunteered at a food bank on weekends. He'd never been married, he said, because he'd spent his 30s and 40s building his career and had somehow let life pass him by. There was a sadness in his voice when he said that, a kind of loneliness I recognized because I'd felt it too. By the end of the night, he asked for my number, and when I gave it to him, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Our first date was at a small Italian restaurant downtown, the kind with checkered tablecloths and candles and wine bottles. Michael was attentive in a way that felt old-fashioned, like he actually cared what I had to say. He asked about my daughter, about my teaching, about the books I loved. He listened, really listened, and when I talked about my divorce, about how my ex-husband had cheated with a colleague and destroyed 15 years of marriage in one stupid affair, Michael reached across the table and squeezed my hand. He said he was sorry I'd been hurt like that I deserved better, and I believed him. God help me, I believed every single word. We started seeing each other regularly after that, quiet dinners and walks along the Battery, Sunday mornings at the farmer's market where he'd buy fresh flowers and leave them on my doorstep with handwritten notes. He integrated himself into my life so smoothly, so naturally, that within a few months it felt like he'd always been there. My daughter liked him when she came home for Thanksgiving. My friends thought he was charming. Even my mother, who'd been skeptical of every man I'd dated since the divorce, told me she had a good feeling about Michael. But looking back now, I realized there were things I should have noticed. Small inconsistencies that I explained away because I wanted so badly to believe in him. He never talked about his family, and when I asked, he'd get this distant look and say they were estranged, that it was complicated. He didn't have social media, which he said was because he valued his privacy and didn't see the point in broadcasting his life online. His phone would ring sometimes, and he'd glance at the screen and let it go to voicemail without explanation. Once, I saw him shred a letter before I could ask who it was from, and when I joked about it, he said it was just junk mail, but his jaw was tight when he said it. There were nights he'd cancel plans last minute, saying he had to drive to Atlanta or Charlotte for work, and he'd be gone for a day or two with minimal contact. I told myself it was fine, that he was just busy, that not everyone needed to share every detail of their life. I told myself I was being paranoid, that my ex-husband's betrayal had made me suspicious of good men. And Michael was good. He made me laugh. He made me feel seen. He made me feel like I mattered. 6 months after we met, he proposed on Folly Beach at sunset. It was simple and perfect. No grand gestures, just the two of us and the ocean and a ring that had belonged to his grandmother. he said. I cried when I said yes. Not just because I was happy, but because I felt like I'd been given a second chance at the life I thought I'd lost. We planned a small wedding for the following spring, just 20 guests at a historic inn overlooking the harbor. Nothing fancy, just intimate and meaningful. My daughter was my maid of honor. Michael's best man was a college friend from Boston named David, a quiet guy who barely spoke during the rehearsal dinner and left right after the ceremony. I remember thinking it was strange that none of Michael's family came, but he said they didn't approve of him remarrying at his age, that they thought he should focus on his career. It hurt him, he said, but he'd made peace with it. I hugged him and told him that my family was his family now, that he'd never be alone again. The wedding itself was beautiful. We exchanged vows under a canopy of white roses as the sun set over the water. I wore a simple ivory dress, nothing extravagant, and Michael looked at me like I was the only person in the world. We danced to Louis Armstrong's What a Wonderful World, and I remember feeling completely at peace, like everything in my life had finally aligned. After the reception, we drove to a boutique hotel on the coast, a place Michael had booked months in advance. The room overlooked the ocean, all soft lighting and white linens, with a bottle of champagne waiting for us. We stayed up talking and laughing until past midnight, and at some point, we just held each other and listened to the waves. I fell asleep in his arms feeling safer and more love than I had in my entire life. When I woke up the next morning, the clock on the nightstand reads 6:47. The room was silent except for the sound of the ocean outside. I reached over to Michael's side of the bed, expecting to feel the warmth of his body, but the sheets were cold. I opened my eyes and sat up, confused. His pillow was still indented, but he wasn't there. I called his name, thinking maybe he'd gone to get coffee or take a walk on the beach. No answer. I got out of bed and checked the bathroom. Empty. I looked in the closet. His suitcase was gone. His clothes, his shoes, everything. The only thing left was his wedding ring on the dresser. My heart started pounding. I grabbed my phone and called him. Straight to voicemail. I called again. Same thing. I threw on a robe and ran downstairs to the front desk, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. I asked if they'd seen my husband leave, if he'd checked out, if he'd said anything. The clerk looked at me with pity and said no one had seen him. I ran to the parking lot. His car was gone. I stood there in my bare feet and robe, staring at the empty space where his car had been, and I felt the ground tilt beneath me. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. We'd just gotten married. We'd just promised forever. People don't just disappear after their wedding night. I went back to the room, my mind racing through every possible explanation. Maybe there was a family emergency. Maybe he'd gotten a call and had to leave suddenly and his phone had died. Maybe there was some reasonable explanation and I was panicking over nothing. But then I saw it. A single piece of folded white paper on the nightstand, propped against the lamp where I couldn't miss it. My hands were trembling so hard I could barely unfold it. The handwriting was Michael's, that careful script I'd seen on birthday cards and grocery lists. 4 sentences. That's all he left me. Katherine, I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. But if I stay, they'll find me. And if they find me, they'll come for you too. Forget me. You were never supposed to know. I read it 3 times, trying to make sense of the words. They'll find me. They'll come for you too. Who was they? What was he talking about? What had I never been supposed to know? I felt like I'd been dropped into someone else's nightmare. None of this made sense. Michael was a financial consultant. He volunteered at food banks. He read Hemingway. He wasn't the kind of person who had people looking for him. He wasn't the kind of person who disappeared. But the note was real, and he was gone, and I was standing alone in a hotel room on the morning after my wedding trying to understand how my entire life had just collapsed. I called the police. They sent an officer who took my statement and looked at the note with the same pity the hotel clerk had given me. He asked if we'd fought, if there were any signs of trouble in the relationship, if Michael had a history of instability. I said no to all of it because there hadn't been. Everything had been perfect. The officer told me that sometimes people get cold feet, that it happens more often than I'd think, that Michael would probably turn up in a few days embarrassed and apologetic. But I knew that wasn't it. Michael didn't get cold feet. Michael left because he was scared. The note said so. They'll find me. Someone was looking for him. Someone dangerous enough that he'd abandoned his new wife to protect her. Before we continue deeper into what happened next, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now let's get back to Katherine's story and the nightmare that was only just beginning. For the first 72 hours after Michael disappeared, I barely slept. I stayed in that hotel room because I didn't know where else to go, calling his phone every hour even though it went straight to voicemail every single time. I called David, his best man, and the number was disconnected. I searched for him online and found nothing. No social media, no LinkedIn, no trace of a David Brennan from Boston. I contacted the consulting firm Michael said he worked for, a place called Hartwell Financial Group. They'd never heard of him. I felt like I was losing my mind. How could someone I'd been with for a year, someone I'd married, just not exist? I filed a missing persons report, but the police didn't seem particularly concerned. They ran his name and came back with a driver's license and a clean record, but nothing else. No red flags. No warrants. Just a man who'd left his wife and didn't want to be found. They told me to go home, to give him space, that he'd reach out when he was ready. But I couldn't go home. I couldn't face my daughter or my friends or my mother and tell them that my husband had vanished on our wedding night. So I stayed in Charleston and started searching on my own. I went to Michael's apartment, the place he'd been renting for the past year. The landlord let me in after I showed him my marriage certificate. The apartment was nearly empty. He'd cleared out most of his things, but there were a few items left behind, books mostly, and some mail. I went through everything, desperate for answers. Most of the books were ones we'd talked about, editions of East of Eden and The Old Man and the Sea with his notes in the margins. But there was one book that stood out, a worn copy of The Count of Monte Cristo that I'd never seen before. I opened it, and tucked inside the front cover was an old photograph. It showed a younger Michael, maybe in his early 30s, standing outside a tall office building with two other men. They were all wearing suits, all smiling like they owned the world. On the back of the photo, someone had written Boston, June 2010. I stared at that photograph for a long time, trying to piece together what it meant. Michael had said he'd lived in Boston, so that part checked out. But there was something about the photo that felt off. The way he was standing, the confidence in his posture, it didn't match the quiet, reserved man I'd married. I took a picture of the photo with my phone and ran a reverse image search, not really expecting to find anything. What came up made my blood run cold. The image was attached to a news article from 2012. The headline read, "Boston Investment Executive Missing After $40 million Fraud Scandal." I clicked on the article, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone. The story detailed how a senior partner at a Boston investment firm called Mercer Stone Capital had disappeared after it was discovered that he and two associates had been running an elaborate Ponzi scheme that defrauded investors of over $40 million. The missing executive's name was Marcus Delano, and the photograph accompanying the article was the same one I'd found in Michael's book. The man I'd married, the man who'd called himself Michael Crawford, was Marcus Delano, a fugitive, a criminal. A man who'd stolen millions and vanished into thin air. I sat on the floor of that empty apartment and felt my entire reality shatter. Everything he'd told me was a lie. His name, his job, his past. He wasn't a financial consultant. He was a con man. And I'd married him. I'd trusted him. I'd loved him. The article said that Marcus Delano had been working with two partners, brothers named Eric and Thomas Brennan, who'd also disappeared when the scheme collapsed. Investors had lost their life savings. Retirement funds had been wiped out. The FBI had been investigating for months, but all three men had vanished without a trace. There was a quote from one of the victims, an elderly woman who said she trusted Marcus with everything and now had nothing. I thought I was going to be sick. But the worst part, the part that made my skin crawl, was a line near the end of the article. It said that federal investigators believed Marcus Delano hadn't disappeared to avoid prosecution. They believed he'd entered witness protection, that he'd agreed to testify against his partners in exchange for immunity and a new identity. If that was true, if Michael had been living under witness protection, then everything about our relationship had been a violation of the program. He wasn't supposed to form attachments. He wasn't supposed to marry. And if the people he'd testified against had found out, if they discovered where he was and who he'd become, then the note made perfect sense. If I stay, they'll find me. And if they find me, they'll come for you too. I was in danger, not because of anything I'd done, but because I'd fallen in love with a man who destroyed lives and then tried to disappear. I called the FBI. It took hours of being transferred from one department to another before I finally got someone who would listen. I told them everything: the wedding, the disappearance, the note, the photograph, the article. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then the agent, a woman named Special Agent Rebecca Torres, told me to stay where I was. She'd send someone to pick me up. 2 agents arrived at my hotel an hour later. They took me to a field office downtown and sat me in a windowless room with a table and 3 chairs. Agent Torres was in her 40s, sharp-eyed and no-nonsense, and she didn't waste time with pleasantries. She confirmed what I'd already figured out. Michael Crawford was Marcus Delano, and yes, he'd been in witness protection since 2013. He'd testified against the Brennan brothers, who had connections to organized crime in the Northeast, and in exchange, he'd been given a new identity and relocated to South Carolina. But he'd violated the terms of his protection by entering into a relationship with me, and worse, by getting married. The program had strict rules, and Marcus had broken nearly all of them. Agent Torres said the U.S. Marshals Service, which oversees witness protection, had lost contact with Marcus 3 days before our wedding. He'd stopped checking in, stopped responding to his handler, and they'd been trying to locate him ever since. When I told her about the note, her expression darkened. She said the Brennan brothers had been released from federal prison 4 months earlier on a technicality. Their convictions had been overturned due to issues with how evidence was collected, and they'd walked free. And the first thing they'd done, according to FBI intelligence, was start looking for Marcus Delano. Agent Torres asked if I'd noticed anything unusual in the weeks leading up to the wedding. Any strangers following me, any strange phone calls, anything that seemed off. I thought back and realized there had been things. A black sedan that I'd seen parked outside my house twice. A man in a coffee shop who'd stared at me for too long. A hang-up call on my cell phone the week before the wedding. I dismissed all of it as coincidence. Now I wasn't so sure. Agent Torres told me I needed to be very careful. If the Brennan brothers thought I knew where Marcus was, they might come after me to get information. She arranged for surveillance on my house and gave me a number to call if I noticed anything suspicious. She also told me, in no uncertain terms, that I needed to forget about Marcus. He was gone, and trying to find him would only put both of us in more danger. But I couldn't just forget. How do you forget someone you married? How do you forget someone you loved? Even knowing what I knew now, even knowing he'd lied about everything, part of me still wanted answers. I wanted to know why he'd done this, why he'd dragged me into his mess, why he'd married me knowing it could get me killed. I went back to my house in Charleston, but it didn't feel like home anymore. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump. Every car that drove past made me look out the window. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I started taking a different route to work every day, checking over my shoulder constantly, afraid that at any moment, someone would grab me and demand to know where Michael was. And the truth was, I had no idea. He'd vanished as completely as he had the morning after our wedding, and I was left alone with my fear and my anger and my broken heart. 2 weeks after my meeting with the FBI, something happened that confirmed my worst fears. I came home from work to find my front door slightly ajar. I knew I'd locked it that morning. I stood on the porch, my heart hammering, and called 911. The police came and searched the house. Nothing was missing, but someone had been inside. They'd gone through my bedroom, my closet, my drawers. They'd opened my mail, rifled through my papers. On my kitchen table, they'd left a message, just 3 words scrawled on a piece of notebook paper. Where is he? No question mark. Just a statement, a demand, a threat. The police dusted for prints and found nothing. Whoever had broken in had been careful. Agent Torres called me that night and told me I needed to consider relocating, maybe staying with family out of state until things cooled down. But I refused. I wasn't going to let these people drive me out of my own home, my own life. I'd done nothing wrong. I was a victim in all of this, just like the people Marcus had defrauded. But refusing to leave didn't mean I felt safe. I installed a security system, bought pepper spray, started sleeping with a baseball bat next to my bed. My daughter wanted to come home from college to stay with me, but I told her no. I didn't want her anywhere near this. I didn't want her in danger because of my mistakes. Because that's what it felt like. A mistake. I'd been so desperate for love, so eager to believe in second chances, that I'd ignored every red flag. And now I was paying the price. 3 months after Michael disappeared, I got a phone call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. The voice on the other end was his. Michael. Or Marcus. Or whoever he really was. He said my name, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. I wanted to scream at him, to demand answers, but I couldn't get the words out. He spoke quickly, like he didn't have much time. He said he was sorry, that he'd never meant for any of this to happen, that he'd fallen in love with me, really, truly in love, and he'd thought he could have a normal life, just for a little while. He'd thought he could keep me safe. But the Brennan brothers had found him 2 days before the wedding. They'd sent him a message, a photograph of me leaving work, with a note that said they knew where I lived. He'd panicked. He'd realized that staying with me would get me killed, so he'd left. He'd gone back into hiding, contacted his old handler, and asked to be relocated again. He was calling now to tell me that I was safe. The FBI had arrested the Brennan brothers the day before on unrelated charges. They were back in custody, and this time, they weren't getting out. He told me I could go back to my life, that I didn't have to be afraid anymore. And then he said the words that broke me all over again. He said he couldn't come back, that even though the immediate threat was gone, he'd violated witness protection and the Marshal's service wouldn't allow him to return. He'd been relocated to another part of the country, given another new identity, and this time, there would be no contact with anyone from his old life, including me. I asked him why. Why had he done this? Why had he married me if he knew it could never last? He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was raw with emotion. He said that for 8 years, he'd been living like a ghost. No friends, no family, no connection to anyone. Just moving from place to place, pretending to be someone he wasn't. And then he'd met me, and for the first time since he'd entered the program, he'd felt alive. He'd felt human. He said marrying me was selfish, reckless, and the stupidest thing he'd ever done. But it was also the best thing he'd ever done, because for 6 months, he'd been happy. He'd known it couldn't last, but he'd wanted it anyway. He'd wanted me. I started crying, and I hated myself for it. I hated that even after everything, even after all the lies and the fear and the danger, I still loved him. He told me he loved me too, and that he was sorry, and that I deserved so much better. And then he hung up. I tried calling the number back, but it was disconnected. He was gone. Again. This time, I knew it was for good. A week later, a package arrived at my house. Inside was a USB drive and a letter. The letter was handwritten, several pages long, and in it, Michael or Marcus, I still didn't know what to call him, explained everything. His real name was Marcus Delano. He'd grown up in Providence, Rhode Island, the son of a factory worker and a nurse. He'd been smart, driven, and desperate to escape the working-class life his parents had lived. He'd gotten a scholarship to Boston University, graduated top of his class, and landed a job at Mercer Stone Capital, one of the most prestigious investment firms in the city. For a while, everything was perfect. He was making money, building a reputation, living the life he'd always wanted. But the firm's senior partners, the Brennan brothers, were running a scheme, funneling client money into offshore accounts and using new investments to pay off old ones. Marcus found out by accident, and when he confronted them, they threatened him. They had connections, they said, people who could make him disappear if he talked. So he kept quiet. For 2 years, he looked the other way while they destroyed lives. And then the scheme collapsed. Investors started asking questions. The SEC launched an investigation, and the Brennan brothers decided to pin everything on Marcus. They doctored records, forged his signature, made it look like he was the mastermind. Marcus knew he was going to prison for something he hadn't orchestrated, so he went to the FBI and offered to testify. He gave them everything: emails, account numbers, recorded conversations. In exchange, the FBI offered him witness protection. He testified, the Brennan brothers were convicted, and Marcus Delano ceased to exist. He became Michael Crawford, a financial consultant with no past and no future. He moved to Charleston, rented an apartment, got a fake job, and tried to blend in. For 8 years, he followed the rules. He kept to himself, didn't form attachments, stayed off the grid. And then he met me. He said he knew from the first night we talked that he was making a mistake. He should have walked away. But he didn't. Because for the first time in nearly a decade, he felt like himself again. He felt real. The letter went on for pages, detailing our relationship from his perspective, the guilt he'd felt every time he lied, the fear that had eaten at him every day, the impossible choice he'd faced when the Brennan brothers found him. He said he'd left on our wedding night because he couldn't bear the thought of me getting hurt. He'd rather break my heart than get me killed. He ended the letter by saying that loving me had been the best and worst thing he'd ever done, and that he hoped someday I'd forgive him. On the USB drive was a video. It was Marcus recording from what looked like a cheap motel room somewhere. His face was drawn, tired, older than I remembered. He repeated what he'd said in the letter, but this time, I could see the pain in his eyes. He said he'd been alone for so long, and meeting me had made him realize how much he'd lost. His name, his identity, his life. He'd wanted just a few months of happiness, even if it was built on lies. He'd wanted to feel human again. He said he understood if I hated him, that he deserved it. But he wanted me to know that everything he'd felt for me was real. The love was real, even if everything else was fake. I watched that video a dozen times, and every time, I felt the same mix of anger and heartbreak. How could he have done this to me? How could he have been so selfish? And yet, how could I not understand? He'd been living in hell for 8 years, and I'd been his only glimpse of light. It didn't excuse what he'd done, but it explained it. Agent Torres called me a few days later to tell me that Marcus had been successfully relocated and that his case was now closed. She said I'd never hear from him again, that it was for my safety and his. She also told me that the FBI had recovered some of the money from the original fraud scheme and that restitution was being paid out to the victims. Marcus's testimony had been crucial, and while he'd made mistakes, he'd also helped bring down a criminal organization that had been operating for decades. She said I should try to move on, to rebuild my life, and to put this whole nightmare behind me. But how do you move on from something like that? How do you trust anyone again when the person you loved most turned out to be someone else entirely? I went to therapy. I talked to my daughter, who was furious and heartbroken on my behalf. I leaned on my friends, who didn't know what to say but were there anyway. Slowly, painfully, I started to piece my life back together. I went back to teaching. I started painting again, something I hadn't done in years. I joined a support group for people who'd been deceived in relationships, and hearing their stories made me realize I wasn't alone. There were others who'd been lied to, manipulated, left behind. And we were all trying to find our way back to trust, back to ourselves. 6 months after that phone call, I was doing better. Not great, but better. I'd stopped jumping at every sound. I'd stopped checking over my shoulder. I'd started going out with friends again, even went on a date once, though it didn't go anywhere. I was learning to be okay on my own, to not need someone else to make me feel whole. And then, 1 year to the day after my wedding, I got a postcard in the mail. There was no return address, just a picture of a beach in Greece, all white sand and turquoise water. On the back, in handwriting I recognized, were 4 words: "Thank you for understanding." I stared at that postcard for a long time. Part of me was angry that he'd contacted me again, that he couldn't just leave me alone. But another part of me, the part that still remembered how it felt to be loved by him, was glad. Glad that he was okay. Glad that he was somewhere safe. Glad that maybe, in some small way, what we'd had meant something to him too. I put the postcard in a drawer and closed it. I didn't throw it away, but I didn't display it either. It was just there, a reminder of the strangest, most painful chapter of my life. A reminder that people are complicated, that love doesn't always make sense, and that sometimes the hardest thing to do is forgive someone who doesn't deserve it. I don't know if I've fully forgiven Marcus. I don't know if I ever will. But I've forgiven myself for loving him, for believing in him, for wanting something that was never real. And that's enough. So that's my story. The wedding night that changed everything. The husband who vanished. The secret that almost destroyed me. It's been 2 years now, and I'm still here. Still teaching. Still painting. Still living. I don't know where Marcus is, and I don't need to know. He made his choices, and I've made mine. I chose to stay, to rebuild, to trust again, even when it's hard, even when I'm scared. And if you're wondering what you would have done in my position, if you would have gone with him into witness protection, given up your life, your identity, your family, all for love, I want you to think about that. Because it's easy to say what you do when you're not the one standing in that hotel room, holding that note, feeling your entire world crumble around you. It's easy to judge from a distance. But when you're in it, when it's your life, your heart, your future on the line, the answer isn't so simple. I made the choice that was right for me. I chose myself. And I hope, wherever Marcus is, he's made peace with his choices too. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, if it made you think, if it reminded you that life is messy and complicated and beautiful and heartbreaking all at once, then I'm glad I shared it. And if you want to hear more stories like this, real stories about real people navigating impossible situations, make sure you subscribe. Because the truth is always stranger and sometimes more heartbreaking than anything we could imagine. This has been my story. The story of the husband who vanished, the secret that almost killed me, and the choice that saved my life. Thank you for watching.